When I was 12, I felt like the whole world was against me, including my own family. I wasn't a troublemaker, but my parents treated me like one. For example, I had to be home by 5 p.m. every day, which cut my outdoor playtime short. I couldn't have friends over or go to their houses. Homework came first, no matter how long it took. They refused to buy me video games and made me read books and write reports to prove I actually read them. But what hurt the most wasn't just the strict rules. It was the lack of compassion. My mother was bitter, always making me feel guilty for any accidents or mistakes. My father seemed only to know frustration. He only talked to me when he was yelling at me for poor grades or punishing me for misbehavior. Enough about them now. Let me tell you about Dr. Tanner, the school psychologist. To keep his privacy, let's call him Dr. Tanner. Most junior high schools have a psychologist available to help students with emotional, academic, social, or behavioral issues. Honestly, I had never seen any students talking to Dr. Tanner. Every day, I would walk past his office on my way to the cafeteria and peek through his door's little window. He was always alone, working on paperwork. I guess that most kids were too scared to open up to an adult who was essentially a stranger. After 3 weeks of building up my courage, I decided to see Dr. Tanner on March 2nd, 1993. During lunch break, I stood in front of his office door and knocked. Through the window, I saw him look up, smile, and motion for me to come in. I did. Dr. Tanner introduced himself and asked for my name. He was a soft-spoken man who radiated kindness. In less than 30 minutes, I poured my heart out to him about how my parents were mean and didn't care about me. As I spoke, my voice started to quiver, and I eventually stopped. Dr. Tanner listened patiently, nodding along. I half expected him to dismiss my feelings, say my parents loved me and all that. But he didn't. Dr. Tanner leaned in with a grin and said, "You know, I'm the best school psychologist in the world. I promise we will fix this." I was relieved to hear that promise. The next day, I returned to Dr. Tanner's office after school. It was around 4 p.m. when I walked in. After a warm greeting, he asked me to sit in front of his desk again. He closed the blinds on the tiny window in the door and said, "There, now we have all the privacy we need." We talked about my interests, favorite subjects, and least favorite teachers. About an hour into the conversation, Dr. Tanner offered me a soft drink. I gladly accepted, considering my parents never allowed me to have soda. Dr. Tanner reached into his mini fridge and set down 2 open cans of soda on the desk. Afterwards, we continued our conversation, but it wasn't long before I passed out from whatever drugs were in that drink. When I woke up, my vision was blurred, and it took me a moment to adjust. I found myself handcuffed to a bed with duct tape over my mouth. I began to panic, struggling against the cuffs, but soon gave up. Looking around, I saw posters of superheroes on the walls and photos of famous athletes on shelves. There was an old TV and a Super Nintendo with various game cartridges. It was a room filled with things most kids would dream of having. If only I weren't handcuffed to the bed. Dr. Tanner walked in, sat on the edge of the bed, and said, "Now listen, remember that I'm here to help you, and I would never hurt you, okay?" He gently removed the tape from my mouth and the cuffs from my hands. My first instinct was to cry, but there was something about Dr. Tanner that made me feel safe. He smiled and said, "You're going to stay here for a while. You can play with any toys in this room while I'm here. But when I leave, I'll need to cuff one of your hands back to the bed. You can still watch TV, but only the news channels when I'm gone." I was silent, trying to process everything he had said. "So," Dr. Tanner said, slapping me on the knee, "go ahead and enjoy yourself. I'll be back when it's time for dinner." He left the room, locking the door behind him. I spent the time playing Mario on the Nintendo, my mind still reeling from the shock. At around 7 p.m., Dr. Tanner returned with plates of mashed potatoes and chicken strips. I finally mustered the courage to ask how long I'd be staying. "Well, about a month," he replied, "give or take a few weeks. I have some work to do." The next morning, I woke up to Dr. Tanner patting my head. He told me I didn't have to get up right away, but needed to put the handcuff back on. He looked like he always did at school, dressed in a collared shirt and slacks with a coat over his shoulder and a suitcase by his side. Before leaving, he placed the TV remote next to me and told me to watch the news. The first thing I saw on the news was a breaking news segment. A police officer was giving a press conference about a statewide Amber Alert. I saw my yearbook photo on the screen, with captions about an FBI search and the possibility of me being a runaway. I couldn't believe it. "Okay, but how?" I asked Dr. Tanner when he returned. "I have my ways," he replied. "I'm a man of my word. I promise that within just 1 month, the relationship between you and your parents will change for the better. Forever." He paused before adding, "But I need you to make me a promise. You have to promise that you'll come back to my office after school tomorrow, and that you won't tell anyone about what happened today. It'll be our little secret."